Hey everyone, Harold Fisher, anchor and host of the Daily Drum on WHUR. Welcome to another edition of HUR at Home on WHUR.com and all of our social media platforms. Special night tonight here on HUR at Home as we are talking about election 2020. It is election night. As the results come in, we're going to be talking to Arisha Hatch, Executive Director of Color of Change Political Action Committee, the political arm of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. I want to start, of course, with you, Arisha. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. I appreciate you participating. Also, we're going to be joined by Dr. Ravi Perry. Dr. Perry is the chair of the Howard University Political Science Department. We'll be talking to him shortly. But let me start with you, Arisha. Again, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's a big night.
It is a big night. And of course, as things begin to come in, we will update our viewers. But let us first start with what we're hearing about some of the voter suppression efforts that have been going on over the past week. And indeed, I would argue the past 24 hours. What are you hearing and your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, we know that Black people face extra burdens, extra hurdles in order to actually participate and vote. This is, it's been happening a lot during this election cycle, especially in the last 24 hours, but this is something that's been happening for generations to Black people. And oftentimes we see that there are longer lines in Black communities, less polling places, that laws are stricter in terms of the need for a voter ID. We saw, an instance in Harris County in Houston, Texas, where there was an attempt to throw out over 100,000 votes, probably mostly from Black people, because they used drive-through voting in the middle of a pandemic, a smart innovation during this time. And so, we're just constantly seeing the right wing make efforts to make it more difficult for people to vote instead of making it easier.
Mm-hmm. Let me have Dr. Ravi Perry come in to the conversation because I want to make sure that I also get him to share some of his thoughts specifically about what we're seeing right now. Dr. Perry, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Glad to be with you.
Can you drill down a little bit more about, particularly as it relates to the Black vote today, voter suppression efforts, and some of the other things? There were some reports about robocalls telling people to stay home, and as I mentioned on the Daily Drum during the last hour, I'm still surprised. Number one, that those things are happening, and that they're thought to still be effective.
Yes, the attack on Black voter access to the polls, of course, is as old as 1870 when Black men were first given that opportunity. So voter suppression is not new to the African-American community. What is new is how we fortify ourselves in each and every election for new generation of folks voting to ensure that we are not duped by the targeting. We will continue to be targeted because our voices matter and because our votes have power. And when we vote in lockstep with one another, as we have occasionally from time to time throughout our history and our quest for universal freedom in this country, we have shown up and shown out in ways that has brought the kind of change that makes this country not only live up to its ideals, but finally perhaps grow up and represent the true diversity that it has always been. And that is something that we did not see much in this election. It's important to correlate two things. One, voter suppression is strongly correlated now with Republican Party efforts. And so I mean to make that very clear. And so, because there's a lot of folks in the Black community that like to, equate those issues with something else. But if you are living in a Republican-controlled state legislature, you have a Republican governor, you're likely to be a victim of targeting for voter suppression. You should just know that as a reality and then govern yourselves accordingly, as they say in church. And then secondly, I would say it's important that from Black misinformation, We know from the last Senate Intelligence Committee report from last year that Black folks were the most targeted group by Russia, Iran, the IRA, their version of the CIA, and other entities that have sought to infiltrate this election, not only 4 years ago, but also this year as well. And so if folks overseas know that the Black vote has power so much that they want to target us to disrupt it and hope that we divide and conquer, and that we fall prey to the oldest trick in the book of, crabs in the barrel spreading. If we don't stick in lockstep and understand that we have a threat of a KKK president at our doorstep, and that if we allow that to be renewed again, that we have only ourselves in part to blame, because we do have the power within the Black community and our coalition partners to ensure that this havoc that's been wreaked on us ends tonight.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring in also Bramante Bryant, WHUR news reporter. He has been kind of out and about all day. And Bramante, thank you so much for joining the conversation. Talk to me a little bit about, some of your observations, today as you were, in the process of your reporting assignments. You're on mute. Let's take you off of mute. Want to make sure that we can hear you clearly.
There
we go. Go right ahead.
There we go. Sorry about that. Not a whole lot that was surprising today, but I will say this. I was surprised that we did not see more of the militia types that were out around the polls. I was also surprised that what we saw around the nation, there weren't many long lines for voting. And so that was surprising to me, even in Florida, where we see right now it's neck and neck, and that race has been too close to call. So I was surprised at that. I thought that we would see more long lines, especially with President Trump and the Republicans pushing to have their voters come out on Election Day. You hear Republicans have said often that usually it's Democrats that do more early voting and Republicans that do day of voting. So that was a little bit surprising to me. But really, more than anything, that it's been fairly smooth. We haven't seen a whole lot of nonsense out at the polls. And we're kind of going through the process that we normally do. Now, the key, obviously, is what happens late into the night once we start really seeing more of these final numbers coming out, especially in the battleground states, or the ones that we believe will determine who becomes the next president.
Mm-hmm. Arisha, jump in. I saw you were nodding your head. Your thoughts?
There's really so much at stake tonight. In the neighborhood I'm in, they're boarding up walls and sort of preparing for the worst. I know my organization has been preparing for a number of different outcomes and scenarios so that we can prepare our members to show up strategically tomorrow or whenever we know more. And so, for Black voters during this election cycle, it's beyond the sort of racist hate speech that is becoming, I hate to say a new normal, but normalized in a different way than we've seen in the past. And it's about having a president who's competent enough to lead through a pandemic. It's about how we actually move into this next phase of criminal justice reform and reimagining what our communities look like. And so I've stopped guessing what's going to happen. I refuse to I feel like Florida gets me every year. And so I'm just, I'm praying for a positive outcome, but there's really just so much at stake and a lot of uncertainty.
Harold, if I can't, Harold, can I add this one point to your initial question about being surprised? I will say I was rather surprised to see Joe Biden back out in Philadelphia early this morning. I think he might have hit a couple of spots in Pennsylvania, whereas President Trump really didn't do anything. I think you mentioned this in the newscast. President Trump was over in Arlington at his campaign headquarters in Virginia, and that was pretty much it. So I think what you see here is Biden is basically saying we want Florida, we can win without Florida, but I think he knows if they can get Michigan, Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, the state where he was born, he thinks that they can win it. And as we see now, Florida is still too close to call, in Pennsylvania we probably won't know about in for a couple of days.
Yeah, but we do know Tennessee now going for Donald Trump. That's the latest news that is reported. I wanted to drill down a little bit more on some of the things that Color of Change is doing, the PAC is doing, Arisha, and I'm fascinated by this Voting While Black initiative, even though at least on the East Coast, the voting is over, but we still have people of color who are voting on the West Coast. Talk to me about that initiative and what role it has played and may even be playing right now.
Folks are still on the phone right now in the other office right now, talking to voters on the West Coast, trying to make sure they have rides to the polls, making that last push. And we've been talking to what irregular Black voters, folks that maybe voted for Obama once but didn't come out for Hillary, and really trying to make a case about what's at stake and why it's important, helping people to make a plan. We've had over 25,000 volunteers making phone calls and sending text messages and dragging their friends and families to the polls, in the middle of a pandemic. And beyond the presidential race and many of the congressional races that are happening at the national level, we're also talking to a set of voters about an important district attorney race in their neighborhood. And what we have seen is that while sometimes folks have some doubt about whether voting for president actually impacts their lives, when you begin to talk to them about the local prosecutor and the power that prosecutors have over Black people in our communities, they really begin to see and make the link between why it's important to participate, the ways that it actually impacts them.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Perry, talk to me a little bit more about what Arisha was just talking about. For the past year, it's been Biden, Trump, Trump, Biden, Harris, Pence, Harris, Biden. It's and the other issues that are critically important have really been overshadowed. Are people missing, the bigger picture, or is that, or the broader picture? Because it can't get any bigger than Biden or Trump, certainly. But are they missing, the broader picture? It's either Biden or Trump or whatever else.
I don't think so. I think this year, most people actually, particularly in the Black community, got the message. We learned our lesson from 4 years ago when many of us were, in fact, duped wrongly by misinformation that we believed to be true before we may have had a name for it, before media picked it up 4 years ago. That weekend, that infamous weekend before the election where Comey News came out, where the KKK endorsed Donald Trump, and where, of course, the polls were proven to be wrong. That led to a series of actions in the Black community that we've seen since 2016 across the country, whether it be Black immigrants or it be Black natives to the American South and the slave tradition, or folks who have joined the Black community as allies who understand the shared interests of and the shared issues of oppression that Black communities face with others that the Trump administration has simply just made worse. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. Hate crimes are up. The hate groups are up. The violence and extremist violence against certain groups of people, whether you be Black or LGBTQ, or particularly be a Black trans woman, all of those instances have become very clear, which is why you see in the Black community, I think this time around, very high turnout. The reason why some of those lines were not long today is because tens of millions of Black folks already voted, already casted their ballot. Until today, we had over 100 million votes already cast. That's never happened before in American history. And a lot of those votes were young people who've never voted before. A lot of those votes were old people who have never voted before, who have been motivated as folks of color in particular, and women and other minority groups by this administration that has chosen to say that their lives do not matter. And that's not a statement of partisanship. It's a statement of fact that you can base in the actions or also the lack of actions that this administration has done to alleviate the concern of most pressing issue to Black folks throughout America. And so I think actually what this election has shown is that Black folks have recognized the power of their vote, that they have come out in lockstep, and millions of them voted before today, and millions more voted today. Here in Washington, D.C., I was out at the polls all day, and I saw nothing but a bunch of Black folks and other minorities and a lot of women out today voting and casting their ballots. And the mood is jovial, but the attitude is serious that Donald Trump, amongst most folks, and particularly among that important group of suburban women, so-called independents, the wave is turning blue tonight, and we just might see how blue that wave is in states like Texas and even Georgia, that it could go blue for the first time in presidential contest in all of our lifetimes.
Well, Ramonte, one of the things that I was really, surprised about it, and this is really about the logistics, because during the primary in Maryland, for example, and in some parts of Virginia, let's be honest, it was a mess. It was a mess. Boards of elections were not ready for the pandemic voting and the crush of voters that came out. And yet today, with the exception of Calvert County, Maryland, which saw a really, really long line, but mostly again in DC, Maryland, Virginia, it was virtually flawless. Prince George's County, remember during the primary, they ran out of ballots and there were all kinds of issues going on. Did that surprise you, or do you think that, these governmental agencies, didn't want to get caught with their pants down again?
Yeah, I just think it was one of those things where, in many ways, early voting was a test run for these jurisdictions. So for all of the sort of potholes and the hiccups that they had, they still had enough time to kind of straighten things out. And again, I would say this, because the rush probably wasn't as great, right? Because you had such a large early voting turnout, as Dr. Perry said, in a way, I think that may have actually helped the jurisdictions that you didn't quite have that massive rush, and that you didn't quite have the same issues. I voted early in Maryland, and to be quite honest, I was shocked, my wife and I, first of all, how quickly we moved through the line, how orderly it was, and how they had everything in place. And, as reporters, we kind of, you sort of have a cynical attitude, and you're expecting that there are going to be some mishaps. So no. I think in some ways, that early voting helped them prepare for what we've seen today.
Arisha, we are, of course, in the midst of getting these results, and certainly we don't know what's going to happen. But talk to me a little bit about some of the the tension, the consternation that a lot of people are feeling right now. And from the perspective of color of change, what do you recommend going forward, whether or not your candidate wins or not tomorrow or Friday or next week, whenever all of this finally is counted out and we have a final solution?
Well, I think most importantly, and what we've been saying to our staff and to our volunteers, regardless of the outcome, we're going to be all right. We know how to survive even the worst of situations. Right now, we're fighting for more ideal conditions under which we can organize. And we do believe that there is a real difference between the vibe that Trump sets and the vibe that a Biden-Harris ticket will set. As well as their general accountability to Black people. I think both of them go to sleep worried about disappointing Black people, because if they are elected, it will be on the shoulders of Black people. And so we're obviously hopeful for that positive result. And if we see that and the pieces are in place with the Congress, like, our hope is that we can accomplish more change for Black people in the next 4 years than we could in the last decade or so. We have an ambitious agenda, and if Biden wins and we have a Senate in place that's willing to work with him, we expect Black voters to be prioritized as administration.
You mentioned something that kind of struck me, making change for Black people. And as you know, Black people are not monolithic. And I would argue that there may be just as many Black people concerned about taxes and the economy as they are about a president who applies a bullhorn to a dog whistle.
Absolutely.
And so how does change for Black people, that statement, that umbrella statement, include everybody?
I think when we're talking to our members across the country, they are talking about how Black people have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, and they want a competent response. Folks want to have good jobs that can pay for the stuff that they want to buy and need to buy for their families. They want to see deeper investment in healthcare and education, especially as we're beginning to reimagine those systems and structures in the middle of the pandemic. Folks want to see changes, although there might be some disagreements about what those changes look like. They want to see changes in the ways that Black people are over-policed and over-incarcerated. And so I do think while we may have differences and folks may fall in different tax brackets, there are a lot of similarities between the things that not only Black voters want to see, but other people of color, other women want to see in this country.
But Dr. Perry, let's piggyback on that a little bit. Having had an opportunity to talk to Black conservatives, Black Republicans, the argument when it comes to being disenfranchised, they're not hearing that. When it comes to being, in some cases, when you're talking about police reform, they're not hearing that. Although they will talk about, President Trump and criminal justice reform, and let's be clear, criminal justice reform and police reform, they may sound similar, but they're not the same. And so, again, back to what I was asking, Arisha, how can you pull the Black conservatives, the Black Trump supporters under the same tent as all the other Black people who would vote for Biden, who are concerned about police reform, who are concerned about being disenfranchised, who are concerned about voter intimidation and all of these other issues? How do you pull them in, or do you just let them do their thing?
Well, I think ultimately politics is about winning, and Black interests, yes, are diverse, but there is a core constituency in the Black community, and that core constituency hasn't been majority Republican since the early 20th century. And so I think
those Republicans are not like these Republicans.
Exactly. No, exactly. And I mean, completely different. I mean, to be very clear. But I would emphasize that what's important here is that, yeah, we do need to bring people together, but we also have to win. And I think there's been a lot of splintering in the Black community. There's splintering between progressives and those on the left. What is progressive and this and that and what have you. That debate has been going on, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years or so. It's also a debate, of course, on the right, whether, as you mentioned, Harold, whether or not to kind of join with the kind of the Black focused agenda items that happen in Black spaces, because while they may be Black, they may ideologically identify somewhat differently and therefore have different goals and different processes to reach those goals as well. Ultimately, we are a Black community, and Blackness is beautiful. Blackness is bold. Blackness is diverse. As a Black gay man, I certainly understand that all of my identities have not been welcomed in every Black room I've been in throughout the course of my life. We have more work to do to cross those bridges within Black circles. And if we're focusing on our interests as Black people, and not just our individual ideological beliefs, not whether or not we agree with person A or issue B, but we focus on our collective interests as Black people. And our collective interests as Black people actually do align regardless of ideology, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of education outcomes in your family and your own personal background. We know that when we come together on Blackness, we win. Our issues win. And yeah, we might then splinter in terms of how to, with the win, move to the next stage. But we got to win first, which means we got to be willing to recognize and say, hey, for example, in this election, y'all, we are facing a KKK person here. This is not a joke. This is not a game. It doesn't matter even if you agree with that person. You can't agree. I would argue that it's very difficult to agree with a presidency that is being supported by a terrorist organization that is anti-Black and then call yourself Black. It's quite a morally compromising position that Black folks have found them in, who are right of center. And I think that it was in our best collective interest to focus on the core constituency in the Black community. And that is not just folks who are necessarily Democrats. There are folks who are pragmatists and who are willing to work within a system that's less than ideal. I'll end with this. Let's remember that Black folks have been fighting for the right to vote long before anyone on that ballot for that right that they were fighting for, they wanted to vote for. Yeah. There was no one really on the ballot in Alabama that they wanted to vote for when they were doing the Selma to Montgomery march. Let's be very clear here. But the issue wasn't about who's on the ballot or what issues are there that speaks to me. If we have those selfish attitudes going to the polls and depart from our collective identity as Black people, then we will lose each and every time. We learned that lesson in 2016. Hopefully we never repeat it again.
Ramonte, we're going to let you go, but I'll let you have a final word before we let you go back to your reporting for the evening.
Well, I think real quick to Dr. Perry's point and his analogy to Alabama and coming across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, what was interesting is once African Americans did go to the polls, and Dr. Perry can correct me if I'm wrong here, Jim Clark, the sheriff, who was part of that damaging incident, pushing those Black folks and whites back across the bridge and beating John Lewis. I think it was either that year or the next year. He was voted out mainly through the votes of Blacks going to the poll. But as I leave, I think the interesting thing now, obviously the presidential election is big, but these senatorial races, I think we still have to keep our eye on, because obviously they can shift the control of the Senate. We see Mitch McConnell has reclaimed his seat. That really wasn't a shocker. So he will be back in the Senate. Now, whether or not he'll be the majority leader or it will be Chuck Schumer, I think that's just as interesting a story, if not as big, obviously, as the presidency.
Ramonte, thank you so much and for also bringing us that late-breaking information. Arisha, I'll let you have the last word before we close out. Certainly, that fits to the chin from hearing the Mitch McConnell thing. I mean, your face said it all, but you're back. You got me on mute again. Let's take that off.
It's obviously not incredibly surprising, but, we hope for something different and better. I think what we've been saying to our members, our mantra is really empower Black joy. That's how we think about the work. And that work will continue regardless of who is in the White House. We know that there is so much work left to do to make sure that Black people can live the full lives that we all deserve to live. And that's what we're committed to for the long haul.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Arisha Hatch with the Color of Change PAC, Dr. Ravi Perry, Howard University Political Science Department, and of course our own Bramonte Bryant. Thank you, all of you, for spending some time with us on this very important November 3rd, election 2020. And we will continue to keep our ears to the ground as information comes out. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.
And that is it for this edition of HUR at Home. I'm Harold Fisher. And as always, I will see you on the radio.